enthousiast als ik toen ik voor het eerst dit programma zag. We gaan nu weer het volgende programma draaien. De Bijbel is namelijk het meest betrouwbare boek dat bestaat. Daar kan ik ook uren over vertellen, want er bestaan geen manuscripten die zo betrouwbaar zijn dan de Bijbel door de eeuwen heen. Dus ook tot op vandaag aan de dag. En daarom hebben we ook deze site, www.woonbijbel.nl. En al die programma's zenden we ook uit op brinktv.com. U kunt ze elk moment kunt u ze zien. Dus als u deze gezien hebt en de vorige niet, dan kijkt u even op brinktv.com. Kunt u ze allemaal weer zien. En woonbijbel.nl wil dus zeggen dat ga nou toch eens een keer in die Bijbel wonen. Want ik blijf zeggen, je leest de Bijbel niet, maar de Bijbel leest jou. Luister maar niet meer naar mij, ga nu het programma maar kijken en ik ben ervan overtuigd dat je ervan zult genieten.
I'm an Iranian Christian theologian and minister and a former Muslim. I am standing in the beautiful building of Westminster Chapel right here in the heart of London. I asked my dear friend Professor Jay Smith to give us a tour of the British Museum. Jay is a specialist on the history of early Islam and he has a number of graduate degrees in Christian theology. He's also had many years of experience debating with some top Muslim scholars around the world. For a number of years, Jay has given a tour of the British Museum to various audiences. So we took a number of Iranian students and asked Jay to tell us about the archaeological finds that we can examine in the British Museum and the British Library. We know that there are many people in the world, including Muslims, who question the reliability and the faithfulness of the historical records found in the scriptures. Can the Bible really be trusted? Can we really trust these fairy tales and mythologies, or are they grounded in historical facts, and do we have any evidences for these things? So Jay gave us, me and a number of Iranian students, a wonderful tour of the British Museum and the British Library to try to show the reliability of the scriptures. Wherever there are historical evidences that we have access to, they confirm and corroborate the biblical account. So we walked through various historical periods in the British Museum. We also visited some of the manuscripts in the British Library. And then Jay and I would come right here to this building, the Westminster Chapel, for further discussions and elaborations on some of the issues that he had raised for us in the British Museum. The authorship of Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch, the Torah, traditionally Jews and Christians have believed that Moses was the author of these books, but we know that critical scholars have raised a lot of questions.
Yeah, and this is one that we really need to hit from the very beginning, and that is, can we trust the authorship of Moses, 1400 BC? There was, for a while, back in the 1800s, even in the early 1900s, there was a lot of speculation whether or not writing even existed that early, and therefore Moses could not have written in 1400 BC something as eloquent as the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, since then, we have discovered an awful lot of new material. Especially in what is present-day Iraq, the Euphrates-Tigris area, we have genre of different tablets written long before Moses. The Ebla tablets, which we will talk about later, written around 2300 BC. You have certainly the Mari, the Nuzi tablets, which come from the same area that Abraham. We'll talk about that later, written a little after Abraham. The Amarna tablets, which come from the same place that Moses was, where he grew up, in Egypt. And again, which are written about the same time period as Moses. So there's been lots of writing that exists long before Moses. So that's no longer in doubt. Nobody questions that anymore. But we need to know that, and we need to be able to trust that Moses could have written this. We do know that Moses grew up in the Pharaonic court, so he would have been taught how to read and write. He would have been a scholar. He would have had the best education in the whole entire civilization of that time. So there's no doubt that the man Moses, who was brought up in that court, would have known how to read and write, and eloquently.
But the problem that many people have pointed out is that there seems to be so many historical events and cities referred to in the Pentateuch, so many significant universal events, that we don't find references to in other world's literature to these events or cities. How do we respond to what kind of other evidences do we have?
There have been quite a few criticisms, particularly of the book of Genesis. I think Genesis, where a lot of them have been zeroed in on because of these universal happenings, like the flood, like the creation account, certainly the references to cities, Sodom, Gomorrah, no reference at all in the historical accounts that we have. Herodotus, the great historian, who gives us the best record for that part of the world right through the ages, never mentions two cities called Sodom and Gomorrah, though he mentions many other cities that we can see there in the biblical account, in the Genesis account. The city of Ur was always in doubt. No reference at all to the city of Ur.
The city where Abraham comes from.
Exactly. The city of Kosabat that Sargon II built was always doubted. The people called the Horites or the Hittites. No reference except the Bible for these people. No record at all. Now, one of the great things is certainly when these questions came up and the biblical scholars put their hands up and says we cannot support it other than the Bible, but we know if given time that we can find these materials, we can find records concerning these cities, we can find records concerning these people. Just be patient. And that's what I always say when people are skeptical about the Bible. The Bible has always been there. It's been around for 3,400 years. Basically, the historians and the archaeologists and the researchers just have to keep scratching. And the more they scratch, the more they find. And the more they find, it turns out the more we shine. It's great because they are basically reproducing our history for us, bringing out stones and bringing out all kinds of artifacts out of the ground. Tablets such as the Ebla tablets, which we'll talk about, the Nuzi, the Mari tablets. We're going to find out that actually the Hittites have been around for 1,000 years. We now know their entire civilization. The British Museum has a room dedicated just to these people. And we're going to find out about the city of Ur. In fact, why don't we go to the city of Ur? Let's go to the British Museum and let's just take a look at two artifacts that are in display right there. A ram that is eating out of a bush, and also the standard of Ur, where you're going to see two artifacts that come from 2600 BC. That's 600 to 700 years before Abraham even existed, from the same city that he lived in. These two artifacts are there. In fact, an entire room has now been dedicated to the city of Ur. It has been found. People have always questioned whether Ur existed. We now know Ur does. Most of the artifacts in this room come from the city of Ur. Specifically, we have the standard of Ur right here. Two sides. One side depicts peace, the other side depicts war. Over here you will see a goat that is eating in a bush. Now, some people have suggested that this may be the source for the story of Abraham and Isaac. As you will notice, it is a goat eating out of a bush, and it is dated to 2600 BC, so this would be 600 to 700 years before the time of Abraham. What you need to understand is the sophistication that you see in this proves that Abraham came from a very sophisticated environment. This is not the source of the story, because this is just a leg that belongs to a table. That's just the one leg there, eating out of a bush. What we do know is that because of these artifacts, the environment that Abraham came out of in Ur was civilized. So when he left Ur to go to Haran in the north first, and then down to Canaan in the south, it was a real sacrifice on his part. This is what he left. Lapis lazuli, gold, the beautiful intricacies you see in this room behind me. All of this came out of that great city of Ur. It is historical. It is a place that Abraham left. When he went to Canaan, he did leave all this behind. When you look at the objects that they have in the British Museum for Ur, and you will notice not only do we have that standard and the goat that's eating out the bush, you'll see that beautiful headdress of that woman, highly sophisticated. You'll see the harps, these harps that were used in the courts and also by the musicians there in their dramas. You will see also a fascinating game. It's a kind of game that looks much like our checkers. We don't know the rules of it, and yet here it is, 2600 BC. Enormous amount of sophistication, enormous amount, proving a civilization that existed, that Abraham came out of, which in many respects shows the faith of Abraham, that he would leave all of this, that he would leave all this sophistication, great background, and go where God had told him to go to a place called Haran, and after that coming on down to the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, to what then would have been called Phoenicia, later Palestine, and of course today Israel, and basically to be a nomad, to leave all that behind, shows me not only that it did exist, and also that this shows how much Abraham believed in God, but also proved to me the faith of that man.
That was one of the most encouraging times in the museum for me, just to see the faith of Abraham began to mean more to me. Yeah. Please continue. Yeah.
Now, there's other things we need to look at as well. There are other areas that, of course, have been questioned by the skeptics, legitimately so. Especially when you look at the book of Genesis. I think Genesis has always been the difficult book because it does have so many enormous events that need corroboration. Ur has obviously been at the top of the list. That's been discovered. The entire city now has been uncovered. A lot of the artifacts are in many museums. We've seen a few there in the British Museum. We will find later on that the great ziggurat that was in Ur there, inside it, when it was refurbished in the 6th century or 500 BC by Nabonidus, we'll find a little drum that comes out of that. It's going to solve a real mystery. Well, I'm going to wait to not tell you about that because that's coming up later on in another segment. And it's important because it excites us when we realize just how little specific things as small as a little drum. In a city called Ur, we needed to find Ur so we could find that little drum to solve another mystery, which you're going to have to wait to find out about. But let's go back to Genesis. Genesis also has another mysteries. For instance, other cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. That has always been questioned. Herodotus, the great historian, never talked about it. We don't find it referenced in any other annal, which would make sense because we know what the Bible says. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed in the time of Abraham. Abraham lived in 2000 BC. Some say 1900 BC, that time period. So it would make sense. If Herodotus was writing in 400 BC, the 5th century, he would not have known about this. It would have been long gone. For that matter, stop and think. Moses shouldn't have known about it either, because he was writing in 1400 BC. So how could he have known about Sodom and Gomorrah? And yet we see in Genesis chapter 14 the reference to Sodom and Gomorrah. We see that God himself came down. It was God that was talking there in front of the tent of Mamre to Abraham as the two angels went off to Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy those two cities. God, Yahweh, that tetragrammaton, which we're going to find out later in this tour as well, we're going to see reference to that in a particular little tablet that comes from the 6th century, 500 BC, the time of Nebuchadnezzar. But God was there talking to Abraham about these two cities. In Genesis 14, verse 8, chapter 14, verse 8, we have reference to these two cities. And of course, scholars have always questioned, since they're in the Bible, uniquely in the Bible, are they mythological, legendary? Did these cities exist? And of course, we've always had a problem because we can't find any reference to them anywhere. Yes, they've been destroyed. That would make sense why Herodotus would not have known about it. But certainly someone should have known about it if they were that significant. In the last century, the scholars, in fact, the archaeologists were scratching around in Syria. And as they were scratching around, as they always like to do, they were looking for these mounds in the desert. Mounds are significant because they denote a number of cities underneath, or one city that has been rebuilt over and over again. We call them tells. That's the word that is given to them by archaeologists. They came across one in Syria called Tel Marduk. That's the name they gave to it, Tel Marduk. And as they started digging down to the different layers, they came down to the 2300-year period. So we're talking roughly 300 to 400 years before Abraham. In that period, they came across a room whose roof had imploded on itself. So in other words, it had crashed down, and on the floor of that room were 14,000 tablets. Wow. Now, tablets, much like you'll see these Amarna tablets that we are going to talk about later also in the British Museum. Tablets are terrific. I'll tell you why. Tablets are made out of clay, and they're fired. They're usually made out of mud, which then can be easily inscribed on. Back in 2300 BC, the language that was used was cuneiform. Cuneiform was the international language, much like Greek became later, and English, you might say, would be the international language that's used today. The reason why it was adopted in 3000 BC is because it was so easy. By around 2000 BC, and again, we're getting to the time period of Abraham and also these Ebla tablets. We're getting to these Ebla tablets. They had created an alphabet that had about 300 letters. These were then even simplified even more. So about 1000 BC, when David existed and Solomon, it was down to 22 letters. And so, as a result of being so simplified, the whole world used it. But let's get back to 2300 BC. 14,000 tablets on the floor, all written in this cuneiform script. And they came across one tablet as they were starting to decipher and translate, and one tablet that talked about 5 cities: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zebulun, and Zoar. 5 cities listed on this tablet. Basically what this tablet was talking about was they were referring to 5 trading cities. But here's the first reference we have to Sodom and Gomorrah. And when they found, of course, they rejoiced, because now we have categorical proof that Sodom and Gomorrah existed. They were on the trade route that was used in 2300 BC, a good 300 years before Abraham. Now, the biblical scholars got especially excited, because when you look at the list of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zebulun, and Zoar, the sequence that is used is exactly the same sequence that we find in Genesis 14, verse 8. Which seems to suggest that there's a reason for the sequence. And you look at the great 5 cities of the Levant. We always use a sequence there. When we talk about the great 5 cities of Levant: Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo, what are we doing? We're following a line on a plane, aren't we? That's why we use that sequence all the time to refer to these great cities of the Levant. The same thing is happening on this tablet. It was referring to a trade route. It was referring to a list of cities of where the trade would go along. So starting in Sodom, going to Gomorrah, going to Admah, then Zebulun and Zoar, suggested that there's a line on a map. And so the archaeologists have gone back to that line. Now we know where Admah is, we know where Zebulun is, we know where Zoar is. Those 3 cities are well known. They're referred to quite often. Herodotus talks about them. We can see that they're on a line of plane. But when you put Sodom and Gomorrah before them, it lands them somewhere up in the Dead Sea. Which then helps us to understand why we haven't been able to find any reference to Sodom and Gomorrah or any physical evidence of this destruction. It's underwater. Remember, the Dead Sea has grown and grown and grown over the centuries. So much so that it's covered up all the residue, all the debris. We don't have any evidence today, but it's starting to recede. I think in future days, when the Dead Sea has been reduced to such an extent because of all the irrigation that's happening up in the Jordan Valley, we're probably going to find evidence for them. Now this gets me excited as a biblical historian, because what this tells me is a number of things. First of all, now I know that Sodom and Gomorrah exists. This is historical. No one doubts anymore that when Abraham was talking to God there in front of the tent of Mamre, and those 2 angels had gone ahead, they were actually destroying those 2 evil cities. That no longer is in doubt. That is historical. The Bible has known this for 3,400 years. But stop a minute, hold on a minute. 3,400 years, Moses. How would Moses have known about these 2 cities? How would he have known specifically to put them in that order? Because they had been destroyed a good 400 years by the time he came into existence. Now, that gets me excited as well, because I now know that even though Moses could not have seen these cities, yet he was able to list these cities in that order. Now, the conclusion is either this is very good oral tradition, which I would doubt, or this is divine edict. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But that also encourages me, because that means if Moses can get it that correct, that he can even list the two cities, get it in the right order of the sequence, but that trade would have no longer been in existence from the time of the Mosaic period, 1400 BC. If he would have known to list it in that order, and I can trust him on that account, I can trust him concerning something as important as listing those cities, then I can trust him in the other areas as well. I can trust what he says about God. I can trust that that was God that met Abraham. I can trust him when he says that was God that was up there on Mount Sinai. I can trust that Moses actually saw God face to face, because of the fact that I can trust him on these other accounts. Corroboration from external evidence gives me enormous amount of trust in not only the text itself, but also gives me an enormous amount of pride that my Bible is correct.
Jay, let's continue about what other evidences from the Genesis accounts can you talk about to confirm more in detail about the stories.
We've talked about Moses, we've talked about the three cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. What about Abraham himself? Let's go back to the Abrahamic period, 1900 BC or 2000 BC. That has always been questioned. Can we trust the Abrahamic period? Of course, many of the historians believe that since Moses was writing so much later, and we don't even, of course, when they first thought that Moses could not have been written, the reference that most people go to is the Gilgamesh epic, was 6th century BC, about 500 BC, that must have been when much of the Pentateuch was written. And then what they say was the material that we find in the Pentateuch written in 500 BC was then redacted back. Redacted is a highfalutin word which basically means pushed back or imposed onto 1400 BC, onto the time when Moses was living. And so therefore, whoever was writing in 500 BC would have known what was happening in 1400 BC. Now, to me that's incredulous that people would want to even suggest that, because how could somebody in 500 BC know exactly what was going on in 1400 BC? More than that, we have to go even further back for Abraham. And this is what gets me excited again. I would love to assume that the historians are correct. However, stop and think. Look at how specific the story is about Abraham. We see a lot of customs there. We see a lot of things going on within the family of Abraham. The fact that Abraham could not have a child through Sarah. And so therefore Sarah gives him her slave maiden Hagar to bear a child, Ishmael. All the customs that we see about the story of Rachel and Leah, the story of Isaac and Ishmael, all these customs, when you look at them, they're very specific. Now, until about a century or so ago, we could not have really corroborated or disputed it. But then we came across two other genre of tablets, two other families of tablets called the Mari tablets and the Nuzi tablets, both of them from the Euphrates Valley, both of them from the same area that Abraham came out of, and close to the same time period. They would have been written, one Nuzi tablets were written in the city of Nuzi, which is very close to present-day Baghdad, and the other one Mari, which is further west, but it's still from the same general location, very close to Ur. And these have given us a window into that time period. They were written slightly after, a few hundred years after, or maybe 150. In fact, the Nuzi tablets are dated to around 1600 BC to 1350 BC. Abraham would have been living 1900 to 2000, so about 400 to 500 years after Abraham. Very close to the same time period that Abraham lived. And it's fascinating to look at these tablets. Let's just take the Mari tablets first. They're further west. When you look at the Mari tablets, you will notice that they give us the names of Antioch, which we know is King Antioch in Genesis 14, referred to there. They give us the name of Nahor and also Haran, which are the two cities that we find in Genesis 24, verse 10. And they also give us the name of Benjamin, the name Benjamin, and these people called the Hapidu. I'm going to come back to that a little later on. But in fact, we're going to probably go look at the Hapidu when we look at the Amarna tablets, which we're going to see later, coming out of Egypt. The Nuzi tablets are even more exciting, because the Nuzi tablets, which come from the city of Nuzi, about 2,200 tablets. When you look at the Nuzi tablets, they are very specific. They talk about customs. Let me just go through some of these customs with you, and you will see that they parallel exactly what we find in the biblical account. For instance, we know that according to the Nuzi tablet, that a barren wife is given a handmaiden by her husband, or to her husband, and that we see in the story of Rachel and Hagar in Genesis 16, verse 3. We also know that a bride is chosen for the son by the father. We find that in the story of Rebekah in the Bible, in Genesis. We see that a dowry is paid to the father-in-law. That we also find in the story of Jacob. Or that work is done to pay off that dowry. We see that with the story of Jacob as well. That there's an unchanging oral will of the father. That we find in the story of Isaac. That a father gives his daughter a slave girl. We find that in two stories in the Bible, and Jessica, Leah, and Rachel both talk about that. Or that there is a sentence of death for stealing a colt god. We find that in the story of Jacob in Genesis 31. Here are these specific customs that we find in the biblical account being corroborated in the Newsy tablets. Now, stop and think. Look how specific these customs are in the Newsy tablets. Look how they parallel almost exactly what we see in the Genesis account of Abraham during the patriarchal period, 1900 BC. If someone had written this in 500 BC, none of these customs would have existed in 500 BC. How could they have known these customs so specifically in 500 BC unless they were there? What that shows me, and I hope it shows you as well, is that whoever wrote the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis either had to be privy to that knowledge or had to be actually an eyewitness to those events. Now we know that Abraham did not write the book of Genesis. Moses wrote the book of Genesis. Not in 1900 BC or 2000 BC, but in 1400 BC. So how did Moses know these customs so accurately? Thank God. I mean, to me, this is not only does it give me credibility and gave me an enormous amount of appreciation for how accurate the Bible is, but it also shows me that God has an awful lot to do with what's going on. Because Moses could not have known about these customs so accurately. I think God put that in the Bible, knowing that this was going to be a question in the 21st century, knowing that we were going to be skeptical about whether or not the Bible is accurate, knowing that there are going to be lots of people criticizing the Bible, and he says, I'm going to put these in there just to help people out to realize that this is not inaccurate, that this is very accurate, and more than that, this is proof that I had something to do with it. It was God that told Moses what was happening during the patriarchal period. The fact that he knew and was able to put these customs so accurately, though these customs didn't even exist because remember, Moses was not in the Mesopotamian Valley. He was not in the Euphrates Valley. He lived in Egypt. He would not have known about these customs. Yet he was able to write that which he knew. God gave him, inspired him, so that we can have the record for today. I'm glad that we do, because now I can go back to those skeptics and I say, believe me, I didn't make this up. None of us made this up, and no one in 500 BC made this up. This actually did happen.
Our time has come to an end on this program. We'll see you next time.